I'm Graham Nichols.
I'm Mark Bentham.
And I'm Katie Holloway, and you are listening to Ordinary. Did you know today, National, or maybe even International, Penguin Day?
I did not know that.
Is that the chocolate biscuit or the animal?
No, it is the animal, I believe. Although I'm sure the chocolate biscuit manufacturer will jump on that. So I will look out for them.
Wow, happy Penguin Day.
Welcome. Now, we can delve into a discussion on penguins if you like, or Graham, you can tell us what you're up to for the next 6 weeks. What's your fancy?
Just on the way to talking about that, I want to say hello to our listeners in the Reading area. You know who you are. So we have some listeners in the Reading area.
What members of your family live there, Graham?
No, it's not members of my family. They may be vaguely connected with my family, but they're not my family. But anyway, thank you for listening. What I'm going to be doing over the next few weeks
Hang on. I want to backtrack to that.
I just want to say hello to our listeners in Blackpool. You know who you are. And also Leeds and Leicester. Any other country I can remember.
I had some feedback from some people in Reading who are listening. And I thought they deserved the credit of an acknowledgement. And indeed all the other people who are listening.
You should say names. If you can do a shout out on the radio.
Oh, I don't know, They
don't want to embarrass people, do we?
They haven't given me permission to give their names, so I'm not going to.
And maybe
there might be a lawsuit coming or something.
And maybe they don't want to be known as someone who listens to Ordinary. There's a difference between being in the Reading area.
A thing of pride. We should get T-shirts printed, I think.
There's a stigma attached.
What? T-shirt printed
what I'm going to be doing.
I'm Ordinary.
I listen to I'm Ordinary. That would be so good. Yeah.
Yeah, if we could sell it, that would be good. Over the next few weeks, I am going to be trying to write a book about engaging in the marketplace, in the literal marketplace, in street preaching, and in the bigger marketplace of ideas in politics, in the media, in social media, and engagement in sort of local communities. So it's a book about that, some of which I have experience with and some of which I don't. And it'll be a fairly short book, but about 40,000 words or so, maybe 60. They want 60, but whether I can write 60, I don't know. So that's what I'm in process of doing.
How many pages is about 40,000 words?
I have no clue, actually.
150.
Yeah. That sounds about right.
150 pages.
I was trying to find the other book, and because I know that's 30,000 words or 35,000 words. I can't remember how many pages it is.
Yeah, okay. It was a decent size in the end, wasn't it? So.
Yeah. So if you're listening and you pray, and by the time you're listening, I'll probably be in the sabbatical. So pray that I would have a clue what I'm doing.
Yeah. So why are you writing that? Like, how did it come about? Why are you doing that?
Partly because I was asked.
Who asked you?
A publisher.
What's the publisher? Is this all disclosed information? I'm just quite interested.
Christian Focused Publications. In the conversations about the book that I have already been involved in, it was in conversations about that the publisher said, "Have you got any ideas?" I came up with this idea. They said no. Came up with another idea. They said no. Came up with another idea. They said no. And I was about to just sort of leave the discussion, and I said, "Well, I could write something on this, but no one's interested." And they said, "No, you should write this."
Fun.
It really flows out of a kind of period of the last 7 years of getting involved in the media, probably more than anything. And then all the other things were kind of peripheral to that, the politics and some of the other things, but particularly getting involved in the local and national media and thinking, okay, how can we translate that to not even church leaders, but to church members? How can we make that of interest, and how could they do something on a smaller scale? How can we also prompt some people to do things on a bigger scale? So that's where it all flowed from.
Cool. And I guess the real question of any writer is how many packets of biscuits is it going to take you to write the book?
Well, none. I'm not a big biscuit eater, to be honest.
Oh, you will be. Just you wait.
Yeah. I've just eaten too many dried apricots because I'm a bit of a dried apricot.
That's not something you want to eat too many of.
No, it's because
there could be consequences.
No, not a biscuit eater. I will eat some, but not that many.
Well,
it's more in my observation of doing it for some odd weeks in the last few weeks it's really hard to to get in the zone and to keep going. It's like writing a sermon, but much, much harder because you've got to write more of it, and you've got to write it every day, and just keeping going.
Yeah. There's always, that's why you need lots of packets of biscuits.
Yeah, probably so. There's always something else you could be doing.
Or you could eat penguins on International Penguin Day. Not actual penguins, but the chocolate penguin biscuit, which is tasty.
I'm going to be actual
yummy.
Penguins.
Yeah, I had the joy of going on a writer's retreat on Saturday, actually, in Brighton, where we all had, it was in a Quaker Friends meeting house.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just like a room in it, and you all just sat down and they set timers and said, you've got to write for this amount of time, go. And then you all check in, and did you meet your goals every time the timer goes off? And then there's lots of tea and coffee and lots of biscuits. And we stopped and had lunch together. It was really fun. You should do something like that, Graham. You'd get it done. Yeah. I got given an actual gold star as well.
Oh, because you achieved your goals?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
Or did everyone get a gold star?
Well, everyone did, but, you know.
How many words
some
did you
people
write?
got 2. I was writing longhand, so I don't know.
Okay, right.
That means with a pen or a pencil for those.
Yes, in a notebook. I wrote 28 pages in my notebook, if that helps.
That's quite people may not understand what that is these days. Notebooks and pencils.
Yeah. Okay, talking of things we need to define. But today, when this goes out, it'll be the last Friday of the month. So we are doing one of God's characteristics. And today we are talking God's sovereignty. Mark, do you want to give us a quick, if you can, quick definition of God's sovereignty? What do we mean by the term?
His kingship, his rule over all things, his control of all things, him working out his purposes in every aspect of life.
Great. Is this a straightforward, easy topic that nobody has any disagreements on?
Yes.
Lovely. Great.
That would be not entirely true. I think wrestling with the sovereignty of God is actually one of the most. I think it is a hard thing to do, but I think actually I have found the greatest comfort in this particular doctrine. I think knowing that God is sovereign over all things actually brings comfort. I think, and we find it hard because in our sinfulness we want to control, and we find that hard to imagine, and therefore we try and find all types of ways to fit God's sovereignty, particularly from a biblical or from a I was going to say biblical, but people from a theist point of view, wanting to uphold there is a God and wanting to uphold free will and our own freedom. That's where the wrestle comes for many.
Yeah. Cool. We'll delve into some of that. Is this a communicable or an incommunicable attribute, Mark? Meaning?
We don't share. We are not sovereign over all things. Although there's aspects, we do have aspects of sovereignty. We are given to rule the earth on God's behalf. So there's an aspect where we are to be, in one sense, vice-regents, co-regents with him in that. We do rule in that sense, but we're not sovereign in the way in which he is sovereign.
Yeah, great. Cool, thanks.
Oh, if only you'd have sounded this good in the job interview.
What job
15 years ago.
Yeah, when he came to, yes. Yeah, we may have given him more money.
Oh, now you tell me.
Is there a story I'm missing here?
No. You do lots of kind of theological interrogation amongst other things when you're interviewing someone for a role as pastor, leader of the church, elder of the church. So yeah, so we asked him about. I think we asked you about federal vision and various other things, which was the
New
thing going on at
perspective.
the time.
I don't even know what federal vision is.
Let's not go there.
Like
let's
policeman's glasses.
Yeah, it's to do with the corporateness of God's salvation, federalness.
Fun.
But yeah.
Tell you what, next time you're interviewing for a new pastor, can I come and throw some questions? Because that would be really fun.
Only if they're theological.
There will be. It's all right, you don't have to say yes to that. Okay, Graham, is there anything that is not under God's control?
No. As well as there's nothing that God didn't make that has been made. So no, there isn't. Unless that was a trick question, and actually you think there is.
No, I don't think there is.
But I haven't thought about it. It's a bit like the sort of philosophical question: is there a limit to what God could do?
Yeah. Could God lift a stone, make a stone so heavy that he couldn't lift it?
Yeah, that kind of thing. God can't lie. Is that a limitation?
Yeah.
It's not a limitation, but in a sense, you might say it's a limitation. So yeah, God in a sense doesn't have any power to change his character, but then his character is perfect and doesn't need changing and isn't subject to change. So it's not a limitation so much as a perfection.
Yeah.
So yeah, and just to reiterate what Mark said, really, it's the philosophical and the practical outworking of that sort of philosophical idea of it that's difficult. I think in the end, Christians all believe in God's sovereignty. Is how they frame it and how they try and work around it, and make it sound a bit different that somehow seems more palatable.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone who believes in God can believe that God's not in charge.
Yeah. Let's delve into some of the specifics then. We're going to go straight off into evil, I think. Just because that's the most... I think this is a topic that comes up most with people who are maybe non-believers or newer believers, or even, to be honest, any Christian, I think, can struggle with this. So if everything is under control, is God causing evil? Is God to blame for evil? Who wants to have a bash at this or start?
Mark does, because he's just reading a book on it.
Yeah, kick us off, Mark.
But I haven't finished it. But we want to be careful how we phrase things. So never does the Bible ever blame God for evil, sin, in that sense. Yet at the same time, the Bible upholds that nothing happens outside of his intentions or purposes. So it's not as if, and I think sometimes we get stuck here because we start to think that evil is some kind of force that is separate from God, as if there's good and these two forces, good and evil. And but there is nothing that happens outside of God's ordained purposes. And the way we talk about it is primarily and secondary. So in the sense of the actual agent of the evil is my intention, my sinfulness, my wickedness. But God has allowed or made that, ordained that purpose. So there is nothing outside that happens in this world outside of his control, including evil.
So
that's really helpful. Yeah. Were you going to say something else? Sorry, Mark.
No.
I think it's really helpful to make the point that it isn't a contrary force, like a balancing force. Like there's good and there's God, and then over here there's evil, which maybe God invented as an entity in and of itself, which would be a more East Asian kind of religious view, the kind of balancing forces or something. Well,
like a Buddhist type.
Yeah.
So just to make this really specific then, and I think this is a question probably lots of us have had from somewhere or other, something like child abuse, who, is God causing that? Or if he's not causing it, he's allowing it to happen if he's there and he's in control. So how can he be good if he's allowing that to happen? How can we start to answer some of these questions?
With difficulty, I think, in the sort of emotion of it, but I think in the philosophy of it, it's straightforward in that it is that simple explanation that the Bible gives in terms of God's absolute rule over everything, but in his purposes, which are at times a mystery to us, he allows in the big history the presence of sin. And so there's a really big question in the kind of sequence of creation and everything. Why is that allowed? Why is sin allowed to enter the world? Once that has happened, then the consequences just flow out, whether it's child abuse or whether it's just death and decay. And, whether it's me needing to wear glasses, when I got into my 40s, they're all one might seem much more serious than the rest, but they're all about living in a world that's decaying, and God in his good purposes allowing that to be so. It just becomes more emotional when it's the child abuse, or even just the child lost in childbirth or something. Why did God allow that to happen? It's always the question, but it's the question to do with aging and everything. And it's part of living in a broken world, which God allowed to be so, ultimately for his purposes, ultimately for his glory, because in the end, it's not about us.
Yeah.
And I think that's the starting point, actually. I think the starting point is where what Graham just said, in the sense of the biggest struggle we have in our culture is that we think God is all about us. In other words, that the world is all about me being happy, content, fulfilled, and that is the greatest aim. But actually, the cross tells us the greatest aim is the glory of God. Now, that can sound quite callous, as if, well, God's only concerned with his own glory and honour, and he doesn't care about us. But I think theologically, there is nothing higher, nothing more honourable than the glory of God. It must be the kind of the primary purpose. Therefore, everything is done that brings that about, including, presumably, God ordained the fall because he wanted to ordain Christ's death and resurrection, because in that very act, the most wicked act of any human act in the whole of history, brings about the greatest glory that is begun to be seen now, but will be revealed in full splendour on that day when Christ returns. So when you have that tracked in, now you begin to see how evil can begin to do that as a result of man's fallenness, as a moment of our rebellion. We are then rejecting God's ways and purposes that he has allowed in that wider purpose to bring about his glory. Now, at times that's very hard to see in the particular aspect of, someone said, well, okay, how is God glorified in a child being abused? Yeah. And the reality is that is very hard for us to see this side. And it only forms part of a larger narrative that will bring about his glory. And often is holding to the truth that in all things God is good. There is a goodness to God. It's not always seen, but God is always good. So therefore, you hold all of those things together, and you end up saying, okay, somehow in all of this, God will be glorified. He is good, even in this most horrific act, because he worked it at the cross, the most horrific act. He must be able to work it in this particular heinous. And God hates it. Let's not be. It's not like God is saying this is a good thing. No way. He's saying this is wicked and evil and will be judged and will be dealt with. But there are greater purposes. The problem is we come at it from our perspective, which says, actually, it must just mean I've got to be happy. And I think as soon as I track along that way, I'm always going to bump up against the sovereignty of God when he doesn't make my world happy.
I think it assumes as well, though, that there's an innocent world with innocent players in it. And then you isolate it down to this moment of sorry, we're talking about this, but child abuse. And you isolate that down to that moment and say, okay, so in that moment, God is actively, at least allowing this to happen. And isn't that terrible of God? But you're not placing it in the context of two sinful individuals living in a sinful world, which at its beginning had a rebellion on our representative head, Adam, who rebelled, and that thread of rebellion which runs throughout and has consequences throughout the whole of history. And there is the glory to God being just and right, and both allowing the presence of evil and judging evil and forgiving evil in the person of his son in the big narrative. And they're part of this bigger narrative. It's not a narrative of let's just take 1 hour in history and say, do we like what God's doing here? It's about the bigger story.
Would you?
Well, I was just going to say on all this is that non-Christians have as big a problem with this in answering this, and actually have a bigger problem in having to answer that than we do. Because if you think about the alternatives to well, if God is not sovereign, then why is child abuse in this world? Actually, the solutions are even worse. The answers that you have to come is either just random. It's all random. There's therefore no meaning, no purpose in this world. So actually, on that basis, there's no morals. There's no reasons to do anything. Then you have to start putting in some stuff. Well, moralism came about somehow, but there's no evidence for that. You're just kind of having to assume because you haven't got an answer to why there is evil.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We're coming at this at quite an academic level, or at least a theoretical level. But if, say, somebody came to you and said, actually, as a child, I was abused, how could God have allowed that? Would you change your answer? Would you change the way you're answering the question? Or would you say the same things in the same way?
Well, you're going to answer with compassion.
Yeah.
And you're going to answer with gentleness. And you're going to answer, but fundamentally, no, you're not going to change your discussion. In fact, I'm sure Graham has, we have these conversations with people. And I think one of the things I'm increasingly convinced about, and the reason why I'm actually currently reading a book, What About Evil, is because increasingly I think this becomes the issue for people often in their pastoral struggles. And unless you can help them work through this issue gently, kindly, compassionately, tenderly, then actually they're not necessarily going to be, unless they can sit back and rest in the fact that actually God's got this, God's in control. I might not be able to see it. I think you end up in greater difficulty and greater struggles, actually, because I think you end up, and it is a really, really hard. Now, this is often why we say, you do your thinking about suffering when you're not suffering, and never do we want to negate the fact that there isn't someone who has acted wickedly. This isn't, well, God has allowed this and they're a puppet. We don't believe that. We believe compatibilism, that man is morally responsible and God has allowed it. Both things are at work. I don't necessarily understand how those things always play out together, but man is morally responsible for their wicked actions. And sometimes they're done in horrendous names and even done in the name of God. But that doesn't also, we don't want to get to a point where you say, well, actually, no, God was, Rabbi Kushner, he wrote a book in the 70s, 80s, hugely became popular. And it originated, I believe, because he suffered he had a child who was born with a rare disease that made him age very fast. So by the time he was a teenager, this child died. And Kushner had to work that through. And in the end, he concluded, along the lines of bad things happen to good people and God just can't stop it at times. Well, that's where you end up, unless you have a very robust, which means helping people pastorally think that through, because otherwise you end up with well, God loves me, but he's just not powerful enough.
Yeah.
Or God is wicked and he hates me. Neither is going to help someone as they seek to rest in and trust in Christ. Yeah.
So in terms of God's sovereignty then, is it that God created the world, the fall happened, so evil entered the world, so God kind of, because of that, it's inevitable that evil will happen and God's not got much to do with it? Or is it that God's continuing to work in every detail and is actively causing somehow every little act, including the evil ones?
That's a great question. I think we're still stuck on the causing and permitting, but without it. But even in the permitting, he's not contingent on somehow, well, this thing here is beginning to happen and I'm going to let it happen. But that's good that it started to happen because that kind of suits my overall purposes. Yeah. God is not a sort of a spectator, acting here, permitting here in a completely sort of isolated, atomized sense.
It's not like he's playing a video game and there's sort of 3 possible ways it could go and he picks one of them. No. I mean, it's so conceptually difficult because you cannot imagine being completely sovereign and completely knowledgeable and how that actually works, and to throw in further, you're outside of time
and in a sense could potentially be simultaneously experiencing the whole of time at the same time at a moment in wherever however you kind of experience it. So you're actually kind of lost before you even start trying to put together these things in any way that's reasonable, because there are so many categories that you can't define. So you have to stick to what you know, which is evil exists, and not as a separate entity, but bad things do happen, and they are bad, and God both hates and will judge those responsible for the bad things that happen, either in themselves or at the cross. So there will be rightness and a putting right of all the evil that happens. So we are clear on that. And there will be the end to evil in the new heavens, the new earth. And God is sovereignly working towards that. But yeah, I'm not sure you can get down into that kind of grainy detail of, well, here's something God actively made to happen, and here's something God just allowed to happen in very specific categories.
Well, I think you want to categorize two areas. He stands behind good in a very different way that he stands behind evil. So he stands behind good and all that is of his will and intentions very much more actively, primarily as the primary agent at times. When it comes to wickedness and evil, he's never the primary. He's never the person bringing about. And I think it is holding that tension that when it comes to evil, we're not puppets. It's not like God is, I'm on a string and God, I'm doing what I am a moral being. He's given me that ability, but at the same time, he is in control of that. Now, those two things are true biblically. But that doesn't necessarily, now you either end up as an open theist, which is the kind of position you were suggesting, which is God is in control, but the way he's in control is he's like a giant chessmate. He doesn't know the future. He just responds to our actions, and as I respond, and he immediately, just because he's the brilliant chessmaker, can just suddenly put in all these things in places to make upon his purposes, and this never changes his great all purposes of bringing all things under Christ, but the detail he doesn't know. So he doesn't know what I'm about to think. He doesn't know what's going to happen this afternoon. He doesn't know what and you go, do I really, that doesn't feel right. Yeah.
What's the problem with that kind of viewpoint?
Well, I mean, do you really want to be worshiping a God who has no idea what's going to happen in the future? Yeah. Do you really want to be worshiping a God who is actually not, all he is an all-powerful being. He has no, but the Bible doesn't ever suggest as that. And of course, what that really pushes is very much influencing human free will. Free will becomes the top trump. That's where your cards are played. Either you hold out that God is sovereign over all things, or you're pushing humans have utter free will, and free will is the big determinant in our. And we want to say, well, the Bible seems to suggest God is sovereign is the bigger card. Then, and it never speaks of me actually having free will, but I am a moral agent who has made decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit like James when in the book of James where he says, when tempted, no one should say God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. So to do with temptation, you can't make an excuse to say God is tempting me any more than you can make an excuse to say God caused this to happen, so I'm not responsible for it. Yeah. Or God allowed this to happen. As Mark was saying, God doesn't stand behind evil in quite the same way. It's just, I think, if you go beyond the very big categories, trying to drill right down to an individual event, I'm not sure is very helpful. Yeah. To say God ordained that I would get married, but he didn't. He just allowed me to get divorced or something. I'm not sure when you get it right down there, because I'm not sure everything is quite as clear as that when it comes down to the individual. You can only think in principle level about how it works. I'm
reading Exodus at the moment with my kids, and then they came up with this question. So this morning we were reading just the start, just before all the plagues, and and it says, they picked up on it as well, that it says, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart and caused him to say no, you may not go. So they were their question was, why did God make Pharaoh say no when he wanted the the Israelites to be free? So how do we see it play out in that context?
That's a good example. That's a bit easier than some.
Yeah, fine.
Because you got a couple of things going on in Pharaoh, haven't you? Where he clearly begins with his own hard heart and opposition, and then God hardens him in that. So you got that playing, but then you got another thread going on, which is ultimately Pharaoh's rebellion will be a display of God's glory in the manner in which he brings the people out, and all of Egypt, let alone all of Israel, will get to see the glory of God as he brings them out by his mighty hand. So yeah, he's given over on the one hand to what he's already wanted to do, to harden his heart. But in that giving over, he's able to bring glory to God by the scale of the rebellion.
So who's responsible for Pharaoh's rebellion?
Pharaoh.
Even though God's hardening his heart.
Yeah. Giving him what he wants.
Yeah. It sounds, I'm not saying it is, but it sounds unfair to say, and as well in the issue of salvation, not just Pharaoh now, but salvation generally, God saves those he'll save, doesn't save those he won't save. We're thinking about predestination, which maybe we can unpick more another time, but it sounds unfair that some people will never be saved because God has always planned that they won't be. How do we deal with that? And maybe just the emotion of it and how it feels and how it sounds to say it.
Well, because I think you've got to start with the other position, which is all mankind have rebelled against God. No one seeks to do good. All have turned away. All have rejected. Since that moment, Adam and Eve rebelled against God, the trajectory of mankind has been one of rebellion. So actually no one is deserving of salvation. It's merciful and all of grace that God would choose any. Now, why he chooses some, why he chose me, not someone else, I don't know. But I do know that he is good. I do know he is gracious. I do know he is fair. He's a compassionate, abounding, slow to anger, merciful. So as I hold on to that characteristic, I have to delight in the grace and recognise the wickedness of my own heart that has been saved from that. I think partly we get stuck because actually we think we're all deserving. Because actually we look around and we all think actually everyone's really very nice. And people are nice. But in the light of who God is and his glory and his holiness, we're utterly wicked. And we hate God. And people, the nicest people in the world come out and just absolutely loathe the Lord. They hate him. And actually, I think we lose sight of just what a repugnant thing that is. And actually, therefore, we lose sight of the mercy and the grace that he would choose any in that sense. So, we feel that in the sense of his grace lavished on us. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we are utterly wicked, far more wicked than we ever imagined.
Because the premise of your question, Katie, is that there's these kind of morally neutral beings who have rights in law, as it were, which is suddenly being denied them, or being denied some, and randomly some are being treated unfairly. It's more that some are being treated graciously, more than they deserve.
And Paul's argument in Romans 9, isn't it, is that God is the potter and we're the clay, and he can do what he likes with the clay. Yeah. And again, we forget that because actually probably postmodern thinking through the, over the last 100 years or so has kind of made man the superior thing, that we think rational thinking and our ability is superior and that we can do everything. So, hence why we've jettisoned God, rejected him. Nietzsche's famous phrase, God is dead, we've killed God. But actually, that's part of the reality for us, is that we think we're superior. We forget we're creatures and there's a creator.
Yeah. So why does it matter that God is sovereign? And why is it a good thing? It's
part of his glory, isn't it? That he's sovereign, and it's essential to his character, because if he wasn't sovereign, you'd have a God who's basically contingent on history or on the accumulation of other forces or in creation. And ultimately, we'd have no trust in God if he wasn't sovereign. You know, Paul kind of annoyingly for some just puts out there what's blindingly obvious, which is if you have a God who is truly God, of course he'll be sovereign, and of course he has a right to do exactly what he wants. Yeah. But that works totally in your favor when he exercises grace and offers to anyone who believes salvation. When they accept that, they can be fully assured, A, that he won't change his mind, because we thought about the fact that God doesn't change in one of our previous ordinaries, but also that he has the power to execute the plan, and nothing will stand in the way of you getting to glory, because he's sovereign. He hasn't got to wait for a few other events to happen on the way, and whoops, if they don't happen, then your salvation's lost. So it's a comfort in that.
Yeah.
But it's a comfort in my suffering as well. You know, when I'm suffering as a believer, this isn't random. This isn't meaningless. This isn't, you know, without any purpose. You know, God is at work. He has allowed, ordained, permitted. Therefore, he will, you know, Romans 8 in its proper content, work in all things for good, for my good, for his glory, ultimately. Now, that changes how I suffer. You know, if I don't believe in a sovereign God, then actually suffering is just random. It's just a bit of bad luck. You know, it got me, it didn't get you. You know, and that, you know, well, it doesn't matter, does it? And in the end, if you push it, which is where people don't, but if you push it, then what is the point of living? It's meaningless. If all I'm here is for 70, 80 years, and for some people they get the rub of the good luck, they seem to get the fortune, the money, the masses, and I don't. Well, you know, that's just a bit of bad luck on you, isn't it? And good luck on them. But it's all meaningless. There's no purpose in it. But if God is sovereign, then there is purpose, there is meaning. Something else is going on. And actually, more than that, it affords me a relationship with him.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So what should our response be to God's sovereignty? If we say, okay, I understand God's in control of all things, and we do believe that, how do we respond to that as believers?
I think it's good to worship God for that. I'm just trying to find the text, the famous one. Oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom of the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his just judgments, and how inscrutable his ways. This is Romans 11, the end of. So when Paul's talking about the complex topic of the future of the people of Israel and talking about God's sovereignty, he ends up in this doxology, this little section of 3 verses where he worships for to him and through him and from him are all things, to him be glory forever. So he ends up worshipping. He kind of says, I can't work it out. I can't work out all his judgments. It's inscrutable. I don't know his mind. I'm not giving him advice. I can't give him anything that he owes me, so I can only worship him, which I think is a really good place to land, obviously, because it's in the Bible, but it seems obviously a good place to land when you really understand how much you don't understand about God's sovereignty. And that was interesting in that verse. He's not just praising him for his acts of salvation. He's standing back from his character and saying, this is awesome, but I don't understand it. So I just need to give you the glory.
Yeah, that's helpful. Do you want to add anything on that, Mark?
Well, I think just flowing from that, isn't it? You know, spell it out: humility, trust. You know, what is my response? Worship, but worship is then expressed in confidence, trust. You know, when James talks about trials, we're to count them joy, not because they're joyful, but because we know that they're purposeful. that the Lord is using it to make me more like Himself. I can only believe that and act in that if I believe God is sovereign. Otherwise, this is just random. There's no point. So the worship is expressed, as Paul goes on actually after that, in Romans 12. Therefore, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. That's how I live. Conforming myself to Him, not to that of the world.
Yeah, Great. Then just as we finish, this may be quite a big question for just as we finish. How does knowledge of God's sovereignty affect how I pray? Actually, why pray? If you're praying, somebody's ill, say, and you're praying, Lord, let them get better, but God's already got a plan for whether they live or die. Why pray about it?
Because His express will is that we do, and when we pray, we I think we talked about it in another podcast as well. It's worth going back and finding it if you can, the one on prayer. But when we pray, we're expressing humility, we're expressing worship, dependence, we're framing ourselves, but we are also in God's purposes being part of the history of that person as well as the history of us. And how He will work out His purposes will include our praying.
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
God,
Bible.
If God plans that somebody gets healed, He's planned to work in your prayers as part of how that happens.
Yeah, but I'm not sure it's even helpful to think at that level, other than to think, I'm called to pray. God loves to hear me pray. There are a lot of examples in the Bible of people who prayed and things happened as a consequence of their prayers in the bigger scheme of how God in His sovereignty works things out. So I'll just follow along with that. I won't kind of speculate on, so did God want me to pray and that prayer to fail, or did He want me to pray and did He want me to be successful? Just get on and pray.
And I think in that context, prayer changes us. There is a sense whereby as I pray those prayers, there is a sense of me giving up my sense of being able to control, fix, sort this, and hand it over to the Lord, which in that sense will which will mean that I will then just trust His sovereign purposes, whether they're healed, not healed. And for the believer, there's a sense, well, I know they'll be healed. I know they're going to, if they're taken to glory, then they're going to be fully healed, or they'll be healed in another way, or He'll work out His purposes in terms of He will use it to make them more like Christ, or He'll use it for kingdom purposes. In other words, as I pray, I'm reminded of what God's purposes are that are often far bigger than my simple prayer of heal them, don't heal them, And I think that in that sense, it reorientates my heart to a greater trust, dependency on the Lord, even as He mercifully hears, responds, and acts in light of that.
Yeah. And there's loads of freedom in that as well, isn't there? I think we can let go of anxiety or fear that we'll make wrong decisions, knowing that we can kind of just rest into the cushion of God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
Definitely.
In all things. Great. Has anyone got any books they want to recommend before we finish?
There are a number that are really helpful in this issue. Maybe we'll put them in the show notes because I can't think of them off the top of my head. But
A.W. Pink, Sovereignty of God.
Well, there's that classic, and there's Scott Christensen's book, which is about evil.
Say it into your mic.
Scott Christensen, What About Evil?
Oh, it's a big one.
But he's also got another one on the sovereignty of God as well, which is really helpful, which is smaller. And Carson actually is the How Long, O Lord, is a really helpful book on suffering and sovereignty.
I think, to be fair, the Wayne Grudem sections in his systematics on sovereignty is good. And John Frame, I don't know if you're into that. He's really good
Doctrine
on
of God.
sovereignty in those sections. So, yeah.
But there's also, we did a whole series on sovereignty. We're looking at the very aspects of evil, evangelism, purposes, salvation. And you can use Christchurch's sermon page where we did a mini-series about 3-4 years ago now, 5 years ago maybe.
We'll try and remember when that was. The loose we will put that in the show notes. I don't even know how to edit a show note, so somebody will, hopefully. Great. Well, Graham's off on his biscuit eating, book writing jaunt for the next 6 weeks. So we'll see you after that.
Send me apricots.
Yeah, not too many.
And prunes.
Me and Mark will be here. We've got some special guests lined up hopefully.
Well, I might not always be here, Katie.
No.
I think you're getting rid of me for some.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll kick them off. We're going to have girls takeover in one of the weeks as well. So look forward for much of that to come. And Mark and I will see you next time. Graham will not. See you then.
Bye.